Hello and good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today for our second MedTech Color Collaborative Community webinar to discuss a pertinent topic that's clearly near and dear to many of us based on the large number of participants who've tuned in today, as it relates to product development and clinical research, but keenly with learning to design with diversity and inclusion in mind. My name is Neda Hanafi, and I am the Chief Strategy Officer for legacy company Experian Group that is now part of Veranex. I also have the privilege of being one of the founding team members of MedTech Color and serve on the board, and I'm also one of the Executive Planning Committee members for the collaborative community. I'm very excited and honored to be joined today by leading experts from some of the giants in our industry, including Edwards, J&J, Medtronic, and ResMed. So today's session is really intended to be the first of a series of webinars so that we can foster a dialogue on best practices as we ground product design considerations around the unique needs of end users. And we also want to elevate awareness and understanding regarding the importance of including diverse and often underrepresented racial and ethnic participants in clinical studies. Before we dive in, I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce you to MedTech Color and the collaborative community. So MedTech Color is an organization, it's a nonprofit that was founded in 2018, and our focus is on advancing the representation of people of color within MedTech. Our core objectives are to increase the number of leaders who enter MedTech and who stay within MedTech, while adding tangible value to the industry's ecosystem via thought leadership and actionable initiatives. We also want to build a strong, diverse network of mentors and sponsors who champion thought leadership and innovative clinical advancement to increase health equity. So to that end, MedTech Color convened this collaborative community to create a forum whereby MedTech professionals and other stakeholders with diverse perspectives, and importantly, the inclusion of the patient perspective, can work collaboratively to address minority health issues in medical device product development and clinical research. As you can see, the MedTech Color Collaborative community has a steering committee that provides direction and oversight and advice and support to the other subcommittees. The steering committee is led by Dr. Carissa Sparks. We then have the Disease State Awareness Committee that is co-led by Regina Dibble and Stephen Makita, the Recruitment and Retention Subcommittee led by Dr. Diana Barber, our Product Development and Clinical Research Subcommittee that's hosting today's panel is led by Kendall Whitlock, and our Evidence Development Subcommittee is led by Molly Vandekar. I want to thank all the subcommittees and the steering committee for their engagement and drive, since we've only been in existence for just 7 months in terms of moving our initiatives and our goals forward. So now, just basic housekeeping, I'd like to say, as you're listening, we're really going to want to welcome your participation by submitting your questions in the Q&A as we move through the discussion. And we will be dedicating some time towards the end to answer your questions. So without further ado, I'd like to start the session. And before I invite our esteemed panelists on, I want to share a quote that was recently shared with me. And it resonates deeply because I think it really aligns with MedTech Color and the collaborative community's mission and why we exist. So health equity is in need of CPR. I'll say that again so it can sink in. Health equity is in need of CPR. So what does CPR stand for, right? It's increased commitment from the C-suite and ensuring that we actually have diverse representation within the C-suite, the key decision makers. We need persistence. We need to keep the pedal to the metal, as change is not going to happen overnight. And the R is resources. We need to come together collectively and commit resources so we can have them there to realize change and ensure health equity, regardless of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, and whatever social construct one has been placed in. And on top of that, we need to hold each other accountable so that we can measure this change. I'd like to move forward and put forward our esteemed panel and invite you guys to come and join me on Zoom. And I know each and every one of them is committed to this topic and is driving change respectively within their organizations and their sphere of influence. So thank you so much for joining us, Jamie, Anthony, and Carlos, and Mark has joined us as well, which is fantastic. We had a little bit of technical issues, but it's been resolved. And I'm actually going to have them introduce themselves. And I'd like you to say your name, your organization, where you are in the world today, so we know how far reaching we are, literally, or where you'd like to be. And, one thing that's inspiring you or bring you joy these days. And then a brief introduction into the work that you're leading to advance equitable innovation. So I'll start off with Jamie.
Thank you, Netta. Thanks for having me here. So my name is Jamie Whaler. I'm the Vice President of Clinical Research at Edwards Life Sciences for the Transcatheter Heart Valve Business Unit. I've lived all over the world, but right now I'm currently residing in beautiful Southern California. It does happen to be raining today. It never rains, so thank you all for your well wishes and prayers. It's a tough day for us here. Let's see, why am I a part of this, or what's motivating me? I will say honestly, Netta, this particular initiative has kept me motivated for the last 2 years. The people that I've met as a part of this initiative, the topics of conversations that we're having, and the fact that for some reason it finally feels different. It feels like we're actually going to move the needle this time. Every time I get into one of these conversations and every time I meet with everyone, I feel inspired and I feel re-energized, and that's what has really become a passion for me, and it's been motivating for me the last 2 years. And what I'm doing right now that makes me really happy is I've been able to join MedTech Color Collaborative as part of the Executive Planning Committee and start helping pull all of you together and all of these different types of activities together. And that's further keeping me energized, especially during such a tough time. So that's where I am right now.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. Tony?
Hi, Netta. Thank you for having me today. It's really an honor to be part of this panel along with such a distinguished group of leaders. So I am based in Southern California. I'm Anthony Hong, but everybody knows me as Tony. So Tony is the name that I go by. And like Jamie, we're braving the storm watch of the late winter here in Southern California, since people tend not to know how to deal with a little bit of rain. So that's where I am. Where would I like to be? I spent the long weekend with my family in Death Valley. We love doing road trips. So I actually wouldn't mind being back in Death Valley where it's nice and dry and do some, hiking where it was just absolutely gorgeous. In terms of what's inspiring me and bringing me joy, I mean, certainly initiatives like this, it's something that I've been deeply passionate about. I lead the Asia Employee Resource Group for J&J, or co-lead. And we're involved in a lot of DE&I conversations. And so to see the momentum of what's happening within the walls of J&J and even outside the walls of J&J is something that's very exciting. The other thing that brings me joy, of course, my kids. I learn a lot from my kids every day. So I often say that as much as I am the father, they're oftentimes my teachers in terms of big lessons. And the work that we're doing, again, not just in terms of the Asia ERG, but as Vice President of Preclinical, Clinical, and Medical Affairs for our cardiovascular and specialty solutions, and a rapidly growing franchise of different therapeutic areas, I really see the momentum that we have built. And oftentimes I say to my kids, change starts with me. And so to be part of a group of individuals that can start to not only help a movement start, but help that momentum continue, is something that I'm excited about and happy to be part of this. So thank you.
Thank you, Tony. I couldn't agree more with kids teaching you a lot. Carlos.
Hello, and thank you. So my name is Carlos Nunez. I am the Chief Medical Officer of a company named ResMed, which is headquartered, there's a pattern here, in lovely Southern California. We are based in San Diego, and I am in San Diego and looking out the window at the breezy, cloudy, kind of drizzly conditions and wondering what's gone wrong. Yeah, so we are very spoiled in Southern California. So a day like this, which when I used to live in other parts of the world would be considered it's an okay day, for us it's a catastrophe. So ResMed, for many of you who don't know, ResMed is the leading provider of digital health and MedTech solutions for respiratory conditions primarily, things like sleep apnea, COPD, and asthma. And I think what brings me joy is the fact that every single day I get to work with an amazing group of people who think first and foremost about how are we going to make it so that everybody in the world gets the therapy they deserve and basically can just breathe. You know, as human beings, the most important thing we do every second of every day is breathe. It's the only thing that if I take it away from you for 5 minutes, you're as dead as a doornail. And so the fact that we have an opportunity to help people breathe in a variety of different ways and lead their best lives just excites me. And the fact that technology and digital health and the amazing surge in diversity and equity and inclusion that's happening in this industry is all colliding as we emerge from this pandemic, hopefully soon, to a world that really has a brighter future for medicine and for technology if we do this right.
Thank you, Carlos. And Mark, last but not least.
So I am not located in Southern California. As you can tell by my background, I'm in Minneapolis, and that is exactly what it looks like outside my window right now. It's actively snowing. We're supposed to get up to 6 inches today. So a slightly different challenge than what you're encountering in Southern California. So I'm a director of research at Medtronic. In particular, I lead a modeling and simulation team that works on new applications in modeling and simulation. And I also lead our enterprise strategy for modeling and simulation, which is really exciting because we get to collaborate across the globe, across all the different verticals where Medtronic operates, and look at strategic applications on how we can use modeling and simulation to improve the quality of our devices and deliver safe and effective devices to patients. One of the things that excites me and humbles me at the same time is just the scope of what Medtronic does. And there's every second more than 2 patients per second are receiving a Medtronic device or being affected by a Medtronic device, which is kind of scary and kind of wonderful at the same time. And just the idea of bringing just 21st century technology to bear in the design of these devices is really fun and really awesome. And my kids are home with me today, so they are bringing me joy. It's a snow day, so that's fun and exciting as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining us today and being willing to share your perspectives and guidance as people think about developing products in a framework that's inclusive and diverse. So based on what we're talking about, let's start off with a simple question, but I think can take us down many roads. And let's start off with Jamie and Edwards. If you could speak to how your company thinks about developing a new product.
Sure.
It's going to be broad.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are actually a pretty narrow company in terms of what we do medically. So we're a permanent implant device company right in the heart. And so when we think in terms of a new product, it generally comes to light because there's an unmet clinical need. And that unmet clinical need can come to us by way of physicians saying they have patients out there that need help with something. It can come to us from a regulatory agency anywhere around the globe that says, hey, there's a gap in the care continuum in our particular geographic region. Can you design something? It can even be something that we see in the data where we go, oh gosh, right, there's something here that needs to have a device either improved upon or developed so we can treat something that we see. But at its most purest form, when we start with a brand new medical device, it starts at the engineering level and it's combined with that unmet medical need where the engineers are looking, generally speaking, for the cardiac condition and the device that they can design that is small enough to be fed through a patient, an incision in a patient's groin, and it has to be able to travel through the inside of their body up to their heart. So we're looking predominantly at size when we first start designing a new medical product. And I think everyone has a different perspective on where they start, but ours is size-based. And then depending on where we are in the development life cycle, we start adding in additional layers of testing, which will bring us to more diversity and inclusion questions along the care continuum as we design those into the research studies themselves.
Excellent. So anatomical location and size is a huge factor for you guys. And maybe Anthony, you could provide your perspective.
Sure. Similar to what Jamie said, we're starting with the unmet need first. I love what Carlos said about helping patients breathe. So at the end of everything that we do, and under me, I have 4 therapeutic areas: cardiac electrophysiology, neurovascular, breast reconstruction, aesthetics, and otolaryngology. And regardless of the therapeutic area, we have to start with the end in mind. What is the patient's need? What are the unmet medical needs that we need to address? And so we really try to gather what I would consider the voice of the physician or voice of the customer. And I worked in pharma for 19 years before moving into medical devices. And while the end user may be a little bit different, and the surgeon and how the surgeon is involved in using the technology is different than, let's say, pharma, where drugs are prescribed and used by patients, we still think about what the ultimate needs are from a patient perspective. That then shapes upstream R&D development, as well as a little bit further down with clinical evidence development. The other thing that we're really trying to do now is, how do we take into consideration more diverse voices? I think we have always sort of gone to what I would consider the usual suspects, but I think we need to broaden our reach in terms of hearing the voices of those perhaps we hadn't heard from previously. And so reaching out to diverse groups of physician advisors to gain insights on what the unmet needs are, but also how do we partner with perhaps patient advocacy groups? So these are some things that are really on the starting point of discussing, but really it's about crossing that finish line and bringing a product that will meet the needs of our physicians, but ultimately the patients.
Great, thank you, Anthony. So maybe Carlos, when you're thinking of bringing a product to market, unmet need, anatomy, you're within the respiratory space. Do you think of diversity, inclusion at each stage within that, research and development pipeline?
We do, actually, and so a lot of very similar themes. You start with an unmet medical need, some gaps, some problems, something that is allowing people to either fall through the cracks or not get the right outcomes, and you start to design from there. And we've heard the terms, and I'm not an engineer, I'm a physician, as I mentioned, but designing for safety, designing for reliability, manufacturability. We also have to design for diversity and inclusion, design for privacy and the types of things that modern digital health therapies, tools, and diagnostics never used to consider before. And in our particular case, I'll talk about sleep apnea because it's our biggest business, but it's a very tricky business. There are 1 billion, that's with a B, billion people in the world with sleep apnea. It's one of the most highly prevalent diseases. And 85% of the people that have it don't know, are undiagnosed and untreated. It's difficult. And the biggest difficulty is the interface between the patient, the mask, and the device. And the mask makes all the difference in their adherence to therapy. And masks fit on faces, and faces look different depending on where you come from, your racial, ethnic background. We have a very large database of anthropomorphic data, but we found out several years ago that it's skewed heavily towards Caucasian and ethnic groups that are much more well represented in medical research. And we've undertaken a very deliberate effort to enroll more and more people. So we've actually gotten to a pretty auspicious milestone where we're approaching 40% of our research database for fitting masks and understanding user interface to our devices are non-white patients now, and continues to grow. So it's important, and it starts at the very early stages of design. And that's one simple, very specific example, but it has to be thought of from the very beginnings of when you design products.
Congratulations on that milestone. That's huge. And we'll get to it later because we want to understand how you managed to achieve that milestone and some approaches others can think about. So Mark, since you work within the data space, maybe you can talk about how data influences your product development approach. And have you maybe encountered potential barriers to accessing data that might limit how you develop a product or inform?
Certainly. So as I mentioned before, our portfolio is quite diverse, and we've heard examples from different verticals. But as we look across the 70 or so chronic diseases that Medtronic treats, where they start to converge is this question about the device's interaction with the patient, and more specifically, the device's interaction with the patient's anatomy. And There's nice history, very detailed history for that and how that's evolved kind of in the orthopedic space. There's been a lot of work on the anthropomorphic variation by geography or by race in the structure of bony anatomy. But that's still really in its infancy when it comes to soft tissues. And so there's been a lot of work to try and grow that space, just as Carlos was describing, to grow that database of that type of anatomy and make sure that that database is representative of the full breadth of the patients that we're trying to treat. Now, as we're trying to do that, we've encountered a lot of challenges with patient data. So trying to balance that question of privacy and security when it comes to clinical data or clinical trial data, and still preserving the types of information or the types of identifiers that would help us to ensure that we're capturing the right diversity of patients. So not all our data is well tagged for gender. Not all of it is well tagged for race. Sometimes that is because of what happened in the way the patient identified themselves in the clinical trial. Sometimes it is in that process that we go through to de-identify or anonymize that data, that those fields get removed. And then by the time it gets to R&D, we're unable to do the types of analyses that would help us answer that question about whether our data is biased. So I think those are some of the things that we as a community need to systematically address.
Thank you, Mark. Maybe we can dig a bit deeper there, because it sounds like it's a catch-22, right? We don't necessarily have the data. We know we need the data. We know there are unique considerations when it dependent on the end user and their specific needs, be it anatomy, racial, and so forth. So I'll open it up to the panel. And again, maybe Tony, you want to jump in first to talk about how maybe it is data privacy, how we can get better data to inform how we produce products. And then also, if there is an unmet need, sometimes it's an unmet need in a specific patient population, not necessarily the marginalized patient population that could truly benefit from that product. Again, a very broad open question, but I'm just going to open it up to the panel for your different perspective.
Sure. I think it's a great point about privacy and confidentiality and access to data. I think this is a hurdle that all of us are trying to overcome and facing as we do our clinical studies and product development. But I also see the power of data in that the downstream results and data that we can gather can significantly impact upstream development. And by this, what I mean is that, and while there's a certain margin of error in terms of how patients have identified themselves, and if the data collection upstream is not very robust, and downstream we're not getting very, very clean data. But if we can do a good job in that, we can start to analyze these subgroups. And those data sets can be very informative of understanding patient anatomy as well as other factors that may contribute to outcomes. When we run subgroups, for example, in a number of our trials across the therapeutic areas, CSS, we start to understand why are we seeing outcome differences in females versus males, outcome differences in African Americans versus Caucasians. We're looking at Asians, so a lot of different ethnic groups. And so if you have a relatively small data set, that may not be very informative. But if there's a way in which we can aggregate large sets of data, then now we have power of information and power of data to really help us understand what is happening. That not only helps shape the upstream R&D, but I also think it helps to shape the care continuum and the choices that our physician partners are making in terms of what technologies or workflows or techniques that may drive differentiated outcomes for these different groups. So I really see the power of data. And in that regard, while we as a company are looking at data sets within, let's say, J&J, within our franchises or cross franchises, I wonder in the future, is there an opportunity to have de-anonymized or anonymized data, I should say, shared between companies where now we have large data sets that really help inform how product development and clinical trials can be designed with the specific patient groups in mind.
Jamie, I see you wanting, oh, Carlos, whoever wants to go next.
Yeah, some thoughts, because this is a really important topic. And I think it becomes extremely important in the context of diversity and inclusion and equity, because not everybody has the same access to information technology platforms. Not everybody understands privacy and security and data privacy and data security as well as they should. And it varies, I think, from across socioeconomic groups, racial and ethnic groups, et cetera. And it's really important because, no offense to our friends in the big tech industry, but big tech players like the Facebooks and the Googles of the world have shown us that if you collect enough data about people, even when it's messy, and even when it's from a variety of sources, enough data, and you can learn about people so that you know more about them than themselves. You can manipulate their behavior. So when you put that in a healthcare context, how do we, in a secure, private, and non-creepy way, collect healthcare data from patients who are part of this digital ecosystem that we all live in now, that can help us develop products more appropriately, do clinical research or the appropriate types of market research to ensure one outcome, that whatever we do, we're doing it on behalf of patients. We don't need to sell banner ads. We don't need to sell information for commercial reasons. What we need to do is understand our patients. And so this conversation is one that has to be had in that context of DE&I, because again, different people will have different levels of access and levels of comfort with technology.
And I think too, Netta, there's something here that we all as researchers sit in various meetings where we have patients who say, your informed consent forms are very confusing for us, right? I participate in a research study because I want to help others, as a participant. And yet you give me a 32-page informed consent form with so much legalese that comes from the meetings that we all have when we sit with the attorneys, that the patients themselves have a hard time understanding even what we're trying to do. And so you sort of marry what Mark is saying, and what Carlos is saying, and what Tony is saying. When research teams can't actually get at the type of data that they need, although we have it, and when we're trying to design studies and we know that there are gaps in the types of patient data or the ethnicities, and we know how to go get it, it's a matter of trying to bring everybody to the table to say, let's pre-specify what the actual intent is here and how we weave that into the research or the question at hand and why we're asking what we're asking. And the more we can do that and be very transparent to those who are participating, the more we can actually give the marks the type of data that they actually need. And Tony can actually design something away that gives us that data to hand over to Mark or to Carlos.
Can I add something to that? I think it's a really important point that you and Carlos made. And in terms of the transparency with patients who participate in our trials, my mother, before she passed away, we would often talk about the work that I'm doing. And I would try to explain to her, product development and clinical trials and evidence. And I actually one time asked her, would you ever participate in a clinical trial? And she said, why? Yeah, I guess, it's good for bringing something new to market, but what do I get out of it? And I thought, that's a very important question. And it's not even about remuneration, but about data sharing. So if we want them to feel that we're collecting data in a non-creepy way, as Carlos said, I like that. How do we disseminate information? Oftentimes we finish our trials, we publish, we have KOLs on the podium talking about the outcomes. It's published data, and it's technically public knowledge. It's in the public domain, but do patients really have access to that information? So our ability to perhaps disseminate in a very easy to understand way the trials that they were participating in and how that's making an impact may help patients to understand, hey, there is real transparency here. There is meaningful outcomes to my participation, and hopefully that can, expand into other participants. But I really think the dissemination piece is an important part of what we, in terms of our communication to patients.
And I'd like to add to that as well. So I think that takes on increased importance because the things that we're asking of these patients, getting the data that we need to inform the existing devices or that next generation of devices, it's non-trivial. It's not free and easy. It can often be invasive. It can often involve things like them getting a CT scan or an X-ray or something more invasive in that data collection. So I think it's really important to be able to communicate to the patients the value of their participation and what it means, because this isn't like filling out a questionnaire or buying something on Amazon and accumulating data. This is really something that's we're asking of them, and they're doing us a huge favor by providing this data for us.
This conversation really gets to an aspect of the trust, right? So why should I? Do they trust the clinical community, research community, big MedTech, previously big pharma, right? And how could we build that trust with the communities we want to serve? It's everyone collectively is coming to the table. It's do no harm, do good, right? Carlos, you're a physician, that's your mandate, Mark as well. But how can we build that connection with these communities and bring them along on the journey? Because if you don't have the data, where it, like you said, it's kind of the crux of it, to inform how we develop more appropriate products. Who wants to go at that first? Tony, I see you on edge. Go ahead.
I'm happy to chime in. I'm not shy about speaking up. I think we need to be a bit more purposeful in who we are partnering with. So, for example, we've created physician advisory boards for various diverse groups. We have a female advisory board. We have, Latin American physician advisory board, Black, physician advisory board, and reaching out to them to understand what are the challenges that they're facing. How are they interacting with patients? For us as industry, oftentimes there's no direct line between us and patients, right? There's sort of a firewall, and the sites are the ones that are interacting with the patients. So engaging these physicians early on and understanding what are some of the challenges as you perhaps speak with patients about the new devices that are being developed, the clinical trials that are available. Also, perhaps partnering with patient advocacy groups and helping them understand why these innovations are being developed. What's the ultimate purpose and goal, and how will these make a value contribution in terms of treating patients? Helping those individuals understand what we're doing, I think, can help to bridge sort of that gap. It would also help us understand maybe any implicit bias that may exist on the part of patients in terms of why they choose not to participate in trials, right? Is it they understand that trials exist and they don't want to participate, or is it they actually have no access to care? So those are important things that I think we need to sort of uncover.
Yeah, Annette, if I can add to that, I'm happy to share. There was a time that we actually ran what we considered at the time to be a failed study, where we were actively trying to recruit minority patients. And we did this about 6 years ago, and we had reached out to the Association of Black Cardiologists and some of our best advisors to come together to help us design this study that could execute and enroll about 100 patients. And at the end, we enrolled about 25. And we never in our wildest dreams thought it was going to be as difficult as it was, because we had all of these excellent groups at the table, right, trying to make this happen and unlock access in hospitals to get contracts done and advertising out and patients enrolled and you name it. And we had sister sites helping the new sites come on board. And it was really well designed. But what we learned after the fact was you can't get a patient to trust just because you have the best and the brightest at the table designing the study. You have to start way earlier, way farther upstream, and educate patients early on about their own healthcare and how to be an active participant in their healthcare and the questions to ask along their care continuum, so that by the time they actually get to needing a procedure, they're already entrenched in the conversation and they have the skills to self-advocate, and they have the trust if they do get presented with the option to be in a research study. And that was a huge lesson learned for us.
Yeah, I've heard two words mentioned by several of the panelists in this last discussion: trust and transparency, over and over again. And I think that that's probably the most important way. We joke about healthcare being 10, 15 years behind big tech and financial industry and adopting technology. And sometimes it's a bad thing, but actually in this case, it might be a good thing because we can take a step back, see where all the pitfalls have been, with the rise of social media and the internet and data privacy always at risk. We can say, how do we do this better? How do we avoid those pitfalls? And you look at a company like Apple, who has said, privacy is a human right. And they build products and they design their ecosystem to minimize the use of data outside of ways that you would think are palatable to you as a user. So the more transparent we can be about, this is the data we're collecting and this is why, then you build that trust. And when people can trust us, people will then say, guess what? Our modern, living, learning, digital healthcare system really does belong to all of us, really does represent all of us, and has found a way for me to feel comfortable, in this digital ecosystem. Without it, we will fail. Without access to the data, the ability to do these types of research. And again, it's not just, RCTs and clinical research. It could be marketing research. It could be the research into how effective a digital health platform is in engaging with its users. As long as they trust us that we're trying to do what's right by patients, and understand that the transparency is real, hopefully we have a better time of it than the other, the big tech companies that are dealing with the creepiness.
That's great, Carlos. I think that was a question someone asked, is how can you decreep it, right? And I think all your discussion is getting at it. Mark, I don't want to miss your perspective on this as well.
So the direction of the conversation was taking me to another kind of upstream effect, which is we've noticed that if you look at implanted devices versus more conservative forms of treatment, that the clinical pathway of the patient actually has a significant impact as to whether they're ever going to end up in a situation where they would be a candidate to be enrolled in a clinical trial just based on the types of clinicians that they've seen, the biases of those clinicians, the communities where those clinicians work, the types of technologies those clinicians have been exposed to. So that's an upstream effect that that is somewhat out of our hands, but we need to be cognizant of and be thinking about as we look to take some of the bias out of what we're encountering in terms of the patient population and the individuals that we're trying to provide therapy for.
That really hits out what Tony was saying as well. Your KOLs or your physician advisory groups and making sure they're extremely diverse, right? But even within them, sometimes they're biased, right? And they don't realize it. And maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion about that bias. And I think starting with, we need to call it out. We all have unconscious bias, and it comes to bear in terms of the decisions we make. And like you said, you all said it in even the prep session, that first interaction with the physician influences the trajectory for that patient moving forward, right? They can or can't, and what access they have. So I just love to, again, put it out there. Maybe, Jamie, let's start with you. What's your take on how we can address some of that bias, maybe as a collective and part of this initiative as a collective as well?
Part of it, I think, is systematic, right? So when I look at our space, we actually have some requirements that are imposed in order for physicians to be reimbursed for the use of the technology in a patient. But in order to get that reimbursement, they have to put this data in a public database or national database, but they have to do a certain number of procedures every year in order to keep access to this technology. That in and of itself, without anybody ever even realizing it, has created a barrier to entry for any number of marginalized communities because they don't have enough volume or physicians who are able to keep the volumes to treat those patients. And this was an unintended bias or an unintended consequence and a bias that we're now working through to try to figure out how to solve. Never foreseen, but this is just one, and I've got a million examples. I'm sure everybody else does too.
I thought Tony or Mark or Carlos are going to chime in right there, read the bias aspect.
I mean, that's an interesting question because when we think about implanted devices and we think about evaluating those implanted devices, we we need to make sure that there's low variation in the implant procedure, that we have the best clinicians operating under the best conditions so that we can tease out that noise and really understand the interaction between that device and the patient. And that by itself is a very different scenario than maybe post-market, the device has been out for a long time, and you're seeing a more diverse population, you're seeing a more diverse set of practices by the clinician, and a lot more variability. So there's a challenge there, especially upfront, early in the process of getting the device to the market, that you need that bias in there reduces the noise that you don't want, so you can be able to see the signal about the device's performance. So that needs some thought.
Challenge to have somewhat. But I mean, I think part of this bias piece is, and we all said it, is actually just recognizing there is a bias. And then how do you work to overcome that? And it's not always bad to have a bias, but if you can call it out and recognize it. And I think it comes to bear strongly when we're trying to collect this unbiased data to inform product development upstream, right, or downstream, and collective learnings.
Yeah, I think it goes back to, you know, the trust and authenticity, right, that we talked about. We've published data. You know, our team on the neurovascular side has published data, and there's also already published data, for example, on the use of IV TPA for patients who are coming in, you know, post-ischemic stroke, and the fact that Black patients are less likely to get IV TPA. I was actually quite surprised by this, because in this regard, there's no bias on the part of the patient. The patient is unconscious, and so we have to understand what is the bias and where is it occurring. Is it somewhere along the care continuum? In which case we need to be partnering with IDNs, hospitals, and physicians to help disseminate where we're seeing the greatest areas of bias. Another example would be Black patients are less likely to be cardioverted upon presentation for treatment for atrial fibrillation. So why is this occurring? And then on the other end, as we start to work with patient advocacy groups and other groups, help sort of understanding what is the bias on the part of the patients. You know, my mother, to use my mother as an example again, used to say, I only want to go to a Korean physician because she says, I feel more comfortable. And I said, Mom, there's plenty of non-Korean physicians that are very, very good. I know many that I can send you to. But there was a bias on her part. So really understanding the bias that exists on the patient side, on the physician side, hospital side, and even us as we think about clinical trials and product development. Understanding those biases and what may be implicit, underlying, I think helps us to overcome and take the right steps.
Yeah, and you know, Netta, we had another experience one time where we were doing a lot of work with physicians trying to understand how to enroll more women in cardiovascular research studies. And one of the physicians in a focus group actually shared with us that she did not present research or informed consent forms to her female patients because she had to see a certain number of patients every day, which meant a certain number of patients per minute. And a female participant tended to ask more questions than a male participant would, and it would throw off her metrics for the day. So she had stopped presenting that as an option. So, and that was unintended bias, right?
Or like you said, the systematic or institutional barriers that are already put in place to limit how you can truly improve outcomes here. Carlos, I saw you unmuted.
Yeah, no, you know, and it's just listening to the conversation. There are so many places from which bias, intentional or unintentional, can come. Everywhere from within the system that we are a part of, you know, the MedTech and the industry, the providers and the networks and the patients themselves. So nothing new that no one has said there, but it's amazing where, you know, listening to Jamie's example of the, you know, trying to just fit enough patients into the day because of my metrics, because, you know, the managed care contracts or whatever we're doing have forced me to operate this way. They've now institutionalized a bias. And we just have to be aware that they exist everywhere. You know, even the medical literature upon which we build the hypotheses for the next generation of research is biased, and we have to recognize where those biases came from, how to correct for them. So it's, again, back to that point we made maybe 20 minutes ago, that this discussion around diversity and equity and inclusion continues to gain traction, not just in our industry, but across the world, throughout society. And we can only hope that as we understand bias, it never goes away. You can never make it go away. You have to understand and work within it. It's just like all the other types of true scientific bias, selection bias, et cetera. So understanding where it comes from, working through it, working around it, and then finding the solutions to minimize and eliminate where you can the types of biases that make it more difficult to do the research and provide the therapy and solutions the patients deserve.
Excellent. And I guess before we transition to Q&A, because there's a lot of great questions coming in, I want to try and get you guys to answer them. So, you know, we have some big industry hitters with yourselves right here, and it's clearly a very competitive landscape, right? And companies do tend to want to work in isolation, but, you know, due to your leadership, you're here as part of this collaborative community because we see the promise in working collectively and being able to move the needle maybe more effectively and efficiently. So maybe each of you could just share your thoughts on where you think there's opportunities for greater collaboration. Is it around the bias? Is it around the systematic institutional biases or barriers? So that companies can come together and have a greater impact. Who'd like to go first? Jamie, go ahead.
Okay. So I absolutely think we need to tackle the institutional biases. There's no question in my mind that everyone has a responsibility and has a seat and an opportunity at the table to make a difference. Whether you're the hospital admit personnel who chooses to admit or not admit somebody, whether you're the physician, whether you're the research coordinator staff, whether you're the sponsor company designing a study, every single one of us has an opportunity to make a difference and to design questions into every single stage of product development that we're executing on. And the more we can encourage our teams, ourselves, everybody around us to ask those tough questions, to ask those inclusion questions, to get uncomfortable asking the questions, to make sure that we're challenging every aspect of the product development life cycle, the better this is going to get for everybody, and we start to move the needle.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And not only within the change that is required within our walls, but it reminds me of a conversation I had with my counterparts at 5 other companies in the neurovascular space, where we said, is there an opportunity for us to understand what's happening within our individual walls? Yes, we're competitors and we're out to win, but if we think about the patients, and ultimately that's our goal, is there an opportunity to share some anonymized data? Is there an opportunity to understand, perhaps even on the regulatory side, what are the challenges that we are collectively facing? And then going to the FDA and having a industry, collaborative and discussions with the FDA to say, what are the sort of levers that we can pull? What are the things that we need to see change so that it becomes easier for perhaps from a product development as well as inclusion of diverse patients? So I really think that from a big data perspective, sharing of anonymized data, collective best practices, that's where industry can make an impact going forward.
And I'd add to that, in addition to the data itself, also, I think being able to work across companies on the best methods for analyzing that data. We spoke earlier about the fact that in healthcare, data isn't free, and we're not going to experience the data volumes that we see in big tech. They're going to be different by orders of magnitude. And there's this concept in data about whether the data sets are similar or whether the data within a set is one population or multiple populations, and helping each other to understand when to split that data apart so you get higher fidelity in those subpopulations, whether the techniques for treating blood pressure in one population, you need to use a different data set with a different data model to do that in another data set will improve the care for all the patients that you're trying to manage with blood pressure. Those techniques, I think, should be shared across industries. And that would, as Tony was speaking to, elevate the care that we're all able to provide to the patients that we're trying to treat.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts along these lines. There is so much that we can do. And I think technology, this promise of digital health, the promise of access to data that can improve patients' lives can be a great equalizer here. And I think that it's an entire ecosystem from the patient all the way through to the industry that provides the drugs and the therapies and devices. And it's really making sure that every step along that pathway, that entire ecosystem is involved and bought into this. We need to work with regulators. We need to work with payers, government and private. We need to work with caregivers, not just the ones that wear white coats and stethoscopes, but those who, might share a bed with someone who suffers from sleep apnea, or share a home with someone who suffers from cardiovascular disease or otherwise. The National Institutes of Health or National Academy of Sciences, I forgot who exactly said it, but they said we need to build a learning healthcare system for the future. And through technology, through digital health, we can do that. And when you look at a platform like Google, it learns every moment of every day based on what people are doing. We got to get so good at working with data and doing research that our devices, apps, whatever, are doing research on their own in the background every single moment and making adjustments and changes to algorithms and things so that patients are constantly getting the care that is optimized for them. That's obviously, sort of future panacea years in the future, but we can take what we've learned from big tech and move forward into this, very exciting era of digital tech for medicine and build something new that starts with transparency and privacy and respect and equity for everybody. So, it's kind of like when countries in undeveloped parts of the world were looking to put in phone lines and wire up villages for the first time. And they're like, why bother? Cell phones are here. You don't need hard lines. And some countries just jumped right to cellular. It's the same sort of thing. We don't have to repeat the mistakes from the past. Let's just jump right to the new thing that's better and built better from the ground up.
Diversity and inclusion at the forefront. Like
Yes.
you said, not repeat the same mistakes. So I know we're fast approaching end of time, and I do want to get to one, we've had several good questions come in, and just for the participants, we're going to use these questions to drive our forward programming so we can make sure we're addressing them. And if we can address them, we'll also offer that up in some kind of format and communication following. But this one kind of caught my eye. And it is something that I've always wondered about as well. So it talks about, on the topic of bias, can you speak to the importance of diversity within the actual engineering team designing the devices, and how we overcome this challenge, given that the engineering industry is overwhelmingly white and male?
Yeah, I think it starts with making sure that the teams themselves are diverse, right? Because everyone brings a different lens to the table, but you got to back that up to say, okay, how do we get more young kids of all different backgrounds interested in engineering? How do we make that affordable? How do you move them through the educational system to then get them into the different companies, the sponsor companies, the design companies, the teams to actually sit at the product development level? So they then bring their personal experiences and their ethnic representation to the product development process. I think it starts way upstream.
Completely agree. In addition to the way upstream, which I absolutely agree about, I think it's accountability, right? We have to hold ourselves accountable as companies, as leaders within our own teams, to ensure that we have diverse representation, not only within the walls and within our teams and the people that are working on these programs and product development, but again, as we've said, diversity in terms of the external physicians and other partners, payers, providers, et cetera, that we're working with. But really, I think looking at ourselves and running those metrics to say, are we diverse? Asking ourselves, and if we're not, we got to hold ourselves accountable. So change, in my mind, starts with me. I always tell this to my kids: don't expect others to change. Change starts with me. We can be the center of that change. And so I think we do need to look at ourselves and say, whether it's engineering, whether it's clinical trials or medical affairs, whatever it is, are we truly representative of the patient population that we are serving? I think that's important for us to ask ourselves.
Mark or Carlos, anything to add there?
So prior to working at Medtronic, I was a faculty member in an engineering school. I won't say which one, but I mean, this was a significant question, and it continues even in industry. And I think Jamie spoke to it earlier, which is it's an upstream question that I mean, some of the stats we were looking at were like 20% of the engineers in graduate school were women. And if you are in industry trying to look at diversity on your team, that's a hard number to overcome. If that's the pool that is available for you to draw from. So I think that then calls us to kind of pick our heads up from where we are right now and looking at who's around the table with us, and actually looking out into how everyone got here, and looking out at what we in the industry need to go back and do at the college level, at the elementary school level, to attract people to our disciplines, to our areas of interest, to this industry, and make a difference in those places as well.
STEM programs, it starts from the beginning, right? And making sure we're being inclusive throughout one's lifespan, should I say. So absolutely. Carlos, you have something to add there?
Yeah, and if I can, I'm going to wrap in one of the other questions that I saw, since we're running short of time. But I think, someone asked about real world evidence and real world data, and it's an area of great interest for me, because, one of the battles that we do fight with regulators, with payers, with peer reviewers, is that, they still, the evidence pyramid, the RCT is at the top. And if it's not a randomized controlled trial, and, that the evidence isn't as good. And I need to constantly remind people, look at what these big tech companies do with real world data. They can literally modify people's behaviors without them even knowing. Imagine if we harness that for good within healthcare. If we are able to get really good at understanding the place for real world data, how it translates to real world evidence, and the ways in which we can change behavior for the better, make someone more adherent to therapy, or show up for their follow-up visits, or whatever it is, and not just because we're trying to sell them an ad or click on this or whatever. And I'm oversimplifying, but I really do believe that we have to get better at understanding how to work with real world data, generate real world evidence, get it more accepted, because it will allow us to learn more about people in the way they truly deal with the healthcare system and combat these biases head on. A randomized controlled trial narrows everything down to as few variables, one variable as possible. It's artificial. It's not real. Real world data, real world evidence, it's real and it's evidence, and you can learn a lot. And so we have to get past that bias that the RCT is the end all and the only source of truth, and understand that there is an entire universe of data out there that will make our healthcare system better and will help patients live their lives better if we learn to work with it and embrace what it means and understand what it doesn't and what it can't do.
In the interest of time, I'll simply say I 1000% agree, and I'm happy that the FDA is more open to looking at the impact of real world evidence. I think this is absolutely vital. So well said.
Agreed.
And I know we are at time. We're actually at time. I can even end with what does meaningful change look like to you? But I think, Tony, you summed it up really well. It's change starts with us, right? And you've all said it, look around the table, who's around you. We need to reflect the patients and the communities we're trying to help and make better health outcomes and inform health equity. I know we had a few slides. I just wanted to thank you all again for your time, your perspectives. I'd love to continue the discussion. There's a lot of questions we didn't get to, and maybe that's in our second webinar in this series as well. And thank you for all the participants for joining today. I also just want to quickly acknowledge the many supporters of the collaborative community as listed here on the slide. We couldn't be developing this programming without them. We will be sending out a follow-up survey. We really welcome your feedback on the discussion and any other topics that you'd be interested in seeing as well. And just a quick highlight, we do have our MedTech Color Pitch competition that's focused on developing 100 Black and Brown CEOs and people of color, and that's coming up on March 8th, so you can access the information on our website and is also in the live chat as well. So our next webinar, look out for it, hopefully early spring, Q2. And again, thank you, Jamie, Tony, Carlos, Mark. It was a real pleasure. And I look forward to the ongoing conversation. So
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good day,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.